What happens when a beloved country music superstar walks into what he thinks is a friendly chat, only to find himself trapped in a hostile interrogation? You won't believe what unfolds when Blake Shelton sits down with The View hosts for what quickly spirals into one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and by the end, America's favorite coach was storming off set in a fury that left everyone speechless. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these hosts completely ambush their guest in ways that will leave you questioning everything about daytime television. Last night's episode of The View was supposed to showcase Blake Shelton's latest album and his upcoming tour dates, but what viewers witnessed instead was a masterclass in how to turn a promotional appearance into a televised nightmare. From the moment Blake walked onto that familiar set with his signature smile and cowboy swagger, something felt different. The usual warm welcome was replaced with strained smiles and an undercurrent of tension that seemed to crackle through the studio air. Whoopi Goldberg's opening was unusually curt, lacking her typical charm as she introduced the country superstar. "We're here with Blake Shelton," she announced with what could only be described as professional coldness. "And we've got some questions for you." Blake. The way she emphasized questions sent an immediate chill through the audience, and Blake's eyebrows raised slightly as he settled into the guest chair, clearly sensing that this wasn't going to be the light-hearted conversation he'd prepared for. Joy Behar wasted no time diving into what would become the opening salvo of an all-out war. "Blake, we need to talk about your recent comments about small-town values," she began, her voice carrying that particular edge that regular viewers know means trouble is brewing. "Some people are saying you've been pretty tone-deaf about what's really happening in America right now." Blake's smile faltered for just a moment as he processed the unexpected attack, clearly caught off guard by the aggressive opening. "Well, Joy, I'm not sure what specific comments you're referring to." Blake responded diplomatically, his Oklahoma drawl becoming more pronounced as it always does when he's feeling defensive. "I've always been proud of where I come from and the values I was raised with. I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating small-town America." His attempt to deflect with charm was met with what could only be described as a coordinated assault from the panel. Sunny Hostin jumped in immediately, her voice sharp and accusatory. "But Blake, when you talk about real America and traditional values, you have to understand how that sounds to people who don't fit into your narrow definition of what America should be." The accusation hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and Blake's face began to show the first signs of genuine irritation as he realized this wasn't going to be a friendly promotional chat. "Now hold on just a minute," Blake said, leaning forward in his chair, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I never said anything about a narrow definition of America. I love this country and everyone in it. I've never excluded anyone from anything." His hands were beginning to gesture more emphatically, a sure sign that the famous Shelton temper was starting to simmer beneath his usually calm exterior. Ana Navarro, sensing blood in the water, piled on with surgical precision. "But your recent endorsements, and the people you associate with, send a very different message, Blake. When you platform certain politicians and ideologies, you're making a statement about who you think belongs in America and who doesn't." Her words were delivered with the kind of calculated malice that turns a conversation into an interrogation, and Blake's jaw visibly tightened as he processed what was happening to him. The audience, which had been anticipating a fun interview about music, and maybe some light-hearted banter about his relationship with Gwen Stefani, instead found themselves witnessing what was beginning to feel like a public execution. Blake's publicist, visible in the wings, was already looking panicked as she watched her client being ambushed in real time on national television. "Ladies, I came here to talk about my music and connect with fans," Blake said, his voice now carrying a warning that anyone who knew him would recognize as dangerous territory. "I didn't come here to be lectured about politics or have my character assassinated on live television. I'm a musician, not a politician, and I think you're way out of line here." The steel in his voice was unmistakable, but the hosts seemed to interpret his pushback as an invitation to escalate rather than retreat. Whoopi, seemingly emboldened by Blake's obvious discomfort, doubled down with the kind of self-righteous indignation that has become her trademark. Nobody's assassinating your character, Blake. We're asking legitimate questions about the platform you have and how you use it. When you have millions of fans, especially young fans, you have a responsibility to consider the impact of your words and associations. Her tone was patronizing in a way that would make anyone's blood boil, and Blake's face was beginning to show the kind of controlled fury that his closest friends would recognize as a very bad sign. The conversation was spiraling into territory that no promotional appearance should ever venture into, and Blake was beginning to realize that he had walked into an ambush orchestrated by hosts who seemed more interested in making a political statement than having an actual conversation. The friendly facade was completely gone now, replaced by the kind of hostile energy that turns television interviews into train wrecks that viewers can't look away from. But this was only the beginning of what would become one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime television history, and Blake Shelton was about to discover just how far these hosts were willing to go to make their point, regardless of the consequences. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees, as Joy Behar leaned forward with the predatory smile of someone who smells weakness. "Blake, let's talk about your fans," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Many of them are young, impressionable people who look up to you. Don't you think you owe them better than promoting divisive rhetoric?" The question was loaded like a shotgun, and Blake's eyes narrowed as he realized they weren't just attacking his politics anymore. They were going after his relationship with his fans. "My fans are not impressionable children, Joy," Blake shot back, his Oklahoma accent getting thicker with each word. "They're intelligent people who can think for themselves. And I resent the implication that I'm somehow corrupting them by being honest about my beliefs." His voice was rising now, the famous Shelton temper finally beginning to break through his professional composure. Sonny Hostin seized the moment like a shark detecting blood in the water. "But honest about what beliefs, Blake? Because when you talk about real Americans and traditional values, that's coded language that has a very specific meaning to a lot of people." She emphasized coded language with the kind of academic condescension that immediately puts people on the defensive, and Blake's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Coded language?" Blake's voice cracked with disbelief and growing anger. "Lady, I don't speak in code. I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. If you've got a problem with me loving my country and respecting the values I was raised with, that's your problem, not mine." The audience was dead silent now, sensing that something was about to explode in front of their eyes. Ana Navarro, clearly coordinating with her co-hosts in what was beginning to look like a planned attack, jumped in with surgical precision. "But those values you're talking about, Blake, they exclude a lot of people. When you say traditional, you're talking about a time when women couldn't vote, when segregation was legal, when LGBTQ+ people had to hide who they were. Is that really what you want to go back to?" The accusation hit Blake like a physical blow, and his face went from frustrated to genuinely angry in a heartbeat. "Are you seriously sitting there accusing me of being a racist and a homophobe?" he demanded, his voice now carrying the kind of fury that makes smart people back down. "Because if that's what you're doing, we're done here. I've worked with people of every color, every background, every orientation in this business, and I've never treated anyone with anything but respect." Whoopi, far from backing down, seemed to feed off Blake's anger like it was giving her strength. "Nobody called you those names, Blake, but your defensiveness is pretty telling," she said with the kind of smug satisfaction that turns disagreements into blood feuds. "All we're doing is asking you to examine the impact of your words and associations. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourself, why?" "My defensiveness?" Blake's voice was approaching a roar now, and viewers could see the exact moment when his legendary self-control finally snapped. "You ambush me on live television, attack my character, insult my fans, and then act like I'm the problem for defending myself? This is the most unprofessional thing I've ever experienced in 20 years in this business. The hosts exchanged glances that seemed to communicate without words. They had him exactly where they wanted him. Angry and off balance, perfect for the kill shot they were preparing to deliver. Joy Behar's smile became even more predatory as she prepared to twist the knife deeper. Blake, we're just asking questions that your fans deserve answers to, Joy said with false reasonableness that fooled absolutely nobody. When you use your platform to support certain politicians and causes, you're making a statement. And when that statement hurts people, especially marginalized communities, don't you think you should be held accountable? Accountable to who? Blake exploded, finally losing all pretense of media-trained composure. To you? To this show? I'm accountable to my fans, to my family, and to my conscience. I don't owe you or anyone else an explanation for my personal beliefs or my right to express them. This is still America. Last time I checked. Sonny Hostin, sensing that Blake was approaching his breaking point, decided to push him over the edge with the kind of calculated cruelty that daytime television hosts sometimes mistake for courage. But it's America for everyone, Blake, not just people who look like you and think like you. And when you use language that excludes and divides, you're contributing to a culture that makes this country less safe for millions of people. The studio fell into complete silence as Blake processed what had just been said to him. His face went through a series of emotions: shock, hurt, and finally, a cold fury that was somehow more frightening than his earlier explosive anger. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried the kind of dangerous edge that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. I want to make sure I understand what you just said to me, Blake said slowly, each word measured and deliberate. You're sitting there on national television, telling me that I'm making America less safe because of who I am and what I believe. You're telling me that my very existence as someone with different political views than yours makes me a threat to other people. His eyes were fixed on Sunny with laser intensity, and she was beginning to look less confident than she had moments before. But the damage was done, and everyone in that studio knew that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The confrontation had moved beyond politics into something much more personal and dangerous, and Blake Shelton was about to show these hosts exactly what happens when you push a man too far. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Blake slowly stood up from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled in a way that was somehow more intimidating than any outburst could have been. His microphone pack clattered to the floor as he unclipped it, the sound echoing through the deadly quiet studio like a gunshot. Let me tell you something, Blake said, his voice now carrying the kind of cold fury that comes from a man who has been pushed beyond his absolute limit. I've been in this business for over 2 decades. I've sat through thousands of interviews, dealt with difficult questions, handled controversy, and always tried to be respectful and professional. But what you just did to me isn't journalism, it isn't entertainment, and it sure as hell isn't professional. Whoopi tried to interject, clearly realizing that things had spiraled completely out of control, but Blake held up a hand that stopped her cold. No, you don't get to talk anymore. You've had your say, now it's my turn. His eyes swept across the panel with the kind of contempt usually reserved for the lowest forms of human behavior. You invited me here under false pretenses, Blake continued, his voice gaining strength and authority with each word. You told my people this would be about my music, about my tour, about connecting with fans. Instead, you ambushed me with a coordinated political attack designed to humiliate me on national television. You attacked my character, you insulted my fans, and you implied that I'm some kind of threat to America because I have the audacity to think differently than you do. Joy Behar, still trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation, made the fatal mistake of attempting to defend their actions. Blake, we were just asking legitimate questions about... Legitimate questions? Blake's voice exploded with such force that several audience members visibly jumped in their seats. You want to talk about legitimate? Let me ask you some legitimate questions. When was the last time any of you stepped foot in small-town America? When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone who doesn't share your political views? When was the last time you treated a guest with basic human respect instead of trying to destroy them for sport? The hosts sat in stunned silence, clearly unprepared for Blake to turn the tables on them so completely. Ana Navarro made a weak attempt to respond, but Blake was just getting started. You sit here in your New York bubble, making millions of dollars to lecture real Americans about their values, their beliefs, their way of life. Blake continued, his voice now carrying the righteous anger of a man who had finally found his voice. You've never worked a day in a field, never worried about making ends meet, never lived in a community where people actually know each other's names and care about each other. But somehow you think that gives you the right to judge the rest of us. Sonny Hostin, perhaps realizing the optics of remaining silent, tried to mount a defense. Blake, we represent diverse viewpoints and we're trying to... Diverse viewpoints? Blake laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. Lady, you wouldn't recognize a diverse viewpoint if it bit you on the ass. You all think exactly the same way, you all hate the same people, and you all use this show as a platform to attack anyone who dares to think differently. That's not diversity. That's a damn echo chamber. The camera operators were frantically trying to capture every moment of what was clearly going to be television history, while the producers in the control room were undoubtedly having panic attacks about how to handle this unprecedented meltdown. Blake turned to address the audience directly, his voice becoming more conversational, but losing none of its intensity. I want to apologize to everyone who came here today, expecting to hear about music, and got subjected to this political hit job instead. You deserve better than this, and frankly, so do I. He then turned back to the hosts with a look that could have melted steel. You want to know what real American values look like? They look like treating people with dignity even when you disagree with them. They look like keeping your word when you make a promise. They look like having the courage to admit when you're wrong instead of doubling down on nastiness. Whoopi made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Blake, maybe we can start over and... Start over? Blake's voice was incredulous. There is no starting over from this. You've shown your true colors today, and they're uglier than I ever imagined. I wouldn't give you the time of day if you were the last people on Earth, let alone trust you with another interview. He began walking toward the exit, then stopped and turned back one final time. I came here as a guest, and I'm leaving as someone who will never, ever forget how you treated me today. I hope the ratings were worth it, because you just lost any shred of credibility you might have had left. The studio erupted as Blake strode off the set with the kind of dignity that can only come from someone who knows they've taken the moral high ground. The hosts sat in stunned silence, clearly realizing that they had not only failed to destroy Blake Shelton, but had instead been completely exposed as the petty, vindictive bullies they truly were. Audience members began standing and applauding as Blake disappeared backstage, their ovation growing louder and more sustained as they realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The hosts tried desperately to regain control, but it was far too late. The damage was done, and everyone in that studio knew that Blake Shelton had just delivered one of the most devastating verbal beatdowns in television history. As the cameras finally cut to commercial, the only sound left in the studio was the continued applause of an audience that had just watched a man stand up for himself, with the kind of courage and integrity that reminded everyone what real American values actually look like.